Hey, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's stream. I thought I'd do something a little bit different today rather than doing some JavaScript exercises, some practice exercises. We thought to actually answer a viewer's question. So obviously get a lot of comments on the channel, and sometimes it can be a bit hard to actually answer them, especially when you need a lot of explanation as to what the solution is or what the answer is to the particular problem. So I thought I'd make a video to answer today's question, just so it's a bit quicker for the person who's made the comment, and just go through a few bits of JavaScript which are related to the problem as well. So today's question actually came up a little while ago on this old video of mine of how to get a user's IP address. And the question comes from a Mr. or Mrs. Blue. I'm not sure, but yeah, we've got this question here. And the whole idea of this video was to basically get the user's IP address using a third-party API service. And they just said they're struggling with how to actually assign the data that you get back into a variable. And this is I've seen it a few times on this video before, because the problem we've got with when we're using the API, we were sending a network request using fetch, and it's asynchronous, which means you don't get the result straight away. So you need to, in this case, use a promise to actually handle the response that comes back from the network call, and then save the data into a variable later on. Okay, so I'm going to hopefully answer this question for Mr. or Mrs. Blue today, and it hopefully should, if you've not worked with promises much before, it should give you a bit of insight how promises and asynchronous JavaScript basically works, or at a fundamental level at least. So let's just replicate what we had in the video. So as you can see, we're using the fetch API to make a call to this endpoint. So it's a service called IPIFY or IPify.org. I think I've used it a few times in different tutorials as well. And if we basically send a request to this particular address, we should get my IP address back in an object in JSON format. But the problem we've got is if we want to actually store this into a variable, if you're new to JavaScript and asynchronous JavaScript, you might do something like this. So you might say something like the result is something equal to the result of the fetch call, and that won't give you any problems. But if you look at the actual result variable, the value that's stored inside of there, you can see we've got a promise. So a promise, if you've not come across it before in JavaScript, it's the same sort of thing as a promise in the English language or in the real world, is you're promising to do something at a later on, a point later on in time. So I promise to give you that money back later on. I promise to do the dishes later on, but it will be something that's not immediate. And because the network call is obviously going out over the internet and is querying some different servers, etc., then that's not an instantaneous thing. So the promise here is basically saying, I promise I'll go and get you that data, and when it comes back, you'll have access to it. So with a promise, we get access to a couple of things here. Excuse me 1 second. So we get access to the data via the then block. And in the case of actually, let's just fill this out. So the then block is where the result of the data from that API call will come from. And we can also catch any errors. And also we can run a bit of code after either there's an error or the response has come back. Okay, so these just accept functions inside of here. So for example, with the finally, we can just say console.log done. And in the then block, we could say something like, well, with the call to fetch, we actually get an object back that has some other things that we can call on there. So let's just say the response here. So this response object, we could just log that out to the console. And this is actually an object that has some other functions available to us. Sorry, I'm really struggling with my cough here at the moment. Excuse me. So there's some other things on there. We'll have a look at that in a second. And then if we do get any errors in this catch block here, we can log those out to the console as well. Oops, let's just get the formatting nice there for us. So we'll say console.error, error in promise, and let's just put that in there as well. Okay, so if we run this code now, we should actually see something rather than just the promise that's been returned back. And because the call will be good, we should see this line being triggered here where we're getting console.log response, and we should see what's inside of there. So we're actually getting another promise back inside of that. Oh, sorry, no, that's the just the result coming back here. So that's the what we've seen in the finally block here. So console.log done. And this is the response object that we got logged out in the then block. And you can see here there's some information about the network request, like such as if it was successful with the status code, etc. And there is actually another function that we can call on that as well to get us the JSON data, which kind of annoyingly for our example actually gives us a promise back as well. So what we'll need to do is say response.json. And with promises, they can be chained. So I guess it is a good example because it's showing us that if we return another promise from this then block, we can then access another then property as well. So we'll say result. And then we'll console.log that result out onto the console. So if we do run this code again, we should see the IP address, my public IP address, being passed back from the network request and displayed here as an object. Okay, so if you've watched the video before, or to kind of get back to Mr. Blue's question, this is basically what we had in the original video, and that's all good. We've got access to the IP address from the network request, but we don't actually, we can't actually store that in a variable or directly from the fetch request because we're kind of in a different block here, so you can't just return the value that's inside of this result and then access it up here at the top level. So there are a couple of solutions for that. The first is basically to, in your sort of global namespace, or the kind of where you're actually making this network request, you just set up an IP address variable or any other variable name that you like, and we'll assign that IP address variable a value once we run the fetch request. So instead here of saying console.log result, we can just say IP address and then its result, and because it's an object and we've got a property of IP, we can just say result.ip. So hopefully that makes sense. We've kind of declared the variable outside of the promise, and then we're calling the promise chain here. And then when we get the result that we're after, when the network request has been fulfilled and we've actually got a promise that's finished, then we can just store the IP address from the network request into that variable. So if we run that again, oops, called something wrong there, hang on one second. Okay, hang on one second. So yeah, we'll just reload the page there one moment, just to clear the existing code that I had out there. And so let's set up that IP address variable again. Let's stop the ads from playing here. And we'll run the code again. Oh, result. I've done something incorrect here. Let me just check here. So we've got the result, and then we should return in response.json, which should give us the JSON data back. Do you know what I've done? I haven't even got the call to the fetch API there. I must have made a mistake when I was updating stuff there. Okay, yeah, so we're in the, let's just set this up again. Okay, and let me just make sure that the IP address variable is set. So yeah, scratch that for a second. Let's just go back to the start of what we were trying to do in the first place there. So let me just get rid of this, and we'll say the IP address. Okay. And then this result. So that was the original promise that we had set up, which had already been read, which is why I got that error. But we want to make the fetch to HTTP, and let's find the IP address, network address again. So it's api.ipify.org, and then format, and equals JSON. Okay. So hopefully this time now we should get the IP address stored into this IP address variable. So IP address. So there you can see we've got a string that's stored into the IP address variable. And if you've just been watching the live stream, maybe just join at that point. Just fast forward to this point because this is exactly what the question that we've been asked should. The quick answer is at least to this question. Okay, so that's all you need to do is basically get a variable outside of the scope of the fetch request or whatever promise-based thing that you're doing, and then you can obviously store the result that you get into that local address. Okay, so there's another way that you can do it, which is slightly more advanced, and it can lead to slightly cleaner code, which is to use async and await. So it's a bit more of a modern JavaScript tool that was introduced that can be used to do the same thing. And it doesn't get rid of the promises. It doesn't make the asynchronous action of making a network request synchronous. It actually just kind of hides all of this kind of complexity, and it makes it look like you're just making a request and storing that that value into into the variable directly. So we can rewrite this in a different way. So we can write a function, maybe saying get IP address, something like this. And we'll make it an arrow function, and we just add the async keyword inside of there. And this will let JavaScript know that we're going to be doing some asynchronous actions, some promise-based stuff inside of here. And we can do the same sort of thing. We'll set, just to illustrate that it can be done the same, both ways as well here. So we'll set a variable of IP address, and then what we'll do, we'll just say, we'll say what we can do is we'll just assign that directly. That makes more sense. So const IP address, and then we'll say we're going to await a call to fetch, and let me just type in the network address again. So it's API IP ify.org / format equals JSON, and that should get the IP address again. And you can combine this with multiple await keywords. So for each, because we need to actually make the response.json call as well to actually go and get that data. But we can actually also make a chain inside of here as well. So we'll say the response is response.json. And of course, you could put all of your error handling in here as well, but there is a different way to do that with async and await. But just for the example, this should be okay. It should just store the value back for us, and that will be the result actually. So let's just say result, and then we'll return from this get IP address function. We'll return result.ip. So that will actually give us the IP address property that's from the object that's returned from this network request. So we can make a simple function like that and use the async and await keywords, which, as you can see, simplifies things quite a lot. But if we were to say I want to get my IP address again, as I mentioned, it doesn't make this call synchronous. There is still the promise-based mechanisms behind it. So if I call that, all I get back from the function is the promise. But you can again use the await keyword in front of the function, and then it should just give us back the string of the IP address directly, which you can see it does. So you need to be careful when using async and await, because there are certain places where you can't use them. So it's probably worth just making sure you understand those technologies completely before you start to use them. But that is the second way of basically getting the IP address and storing it into a variable, because obviously what we could do now is say something like const users IP is equal to that, and then the users IP now stores that string, which you can use in your application or whatever it is that you need to do with it. So there you go. There's a couple of different ways of storing the data into a variable. So hopefully, going back to Mr. or Mrs. Blue's question about assigning the data value or the IP data into a variable, there's a couple of ways of doing it, either using a long promise chain, and then kind of updating a global variable, or just creating a simple function and using async and await to store the result of the IP call into that variable there. So hopefully that makes sense, and I'll see you next time for some more viewers' questions.